Hello there, boys and girls. I just want to start off this story by saying that if you want an answer at the end, you're going to have to prepare to be disappointed, because there isn't one. I was an intern at Nickelodeon Studios for a year in 2005 for my degree in animation. It wasn't paid, of course. Most internships aren't. But it did have some perks beyond education. To adults, it might not seem like a big one, but most kids at the time would go crazy over it. Now, since I worked directly with the editors and animators, I got to view the new episodes days before they aired, and I'll get right to it, without giving too many unnecessary details. They had very recently made the SpongeBob movie, and the entire staff was somewhat sapped of creativity, so it took them longer to start up the season, but the delay lasted longer for more upsetting reasons. There was a problem with the Series 4 premiere that set everyone and everything back for several months. Me and two other interns were in the editing room along with the lead animators and sound editors for the final cut. We received the copy that was supposed to be Fear of a Krabby Patty and gathered around the screen to watch. Now, given that it isn't final yet, animators often put up a mock title card, sort of an inside joke for us, with phony, oftentimes lewd titles such as How Sex Doesn't Work instead of Rockabye Bye Valve, when SpongeBob and Patrick adopt a sea scallop. You know, there's nothing particularly funny, but it are work-related chuckles. So when we saw the title card Squidwards Suicide, we didn't think of it more than a morbid joke. One of the interns did a small throat laugh at it, and the happy-go-lucky music plays as is normal. Now the story begins with Squidward practicing his clarinet, hitting a few sour notes like normal. We hear SpongeBob laughing outside, and Squidward stops, yelling at him to keep it down as he has a concert that night and he needs to practice. SpongeBob says okay, and he goes to see Sandy with Patrick. The Bubbles splash screen comes up and we see the ending of Squidward's concert. Now this is when things started to seem off. While playing, a few frames repeat themselves, but the sound doesn't. At this point the sound is synced up with the animation, so yeah, that's not common. But when he stops playing, the sound finishes as if the skip never happened. There is a slight murmuring in the crowd before they begin to boo him. Not normal cartoon booing that is common in the show, but you could very clearly hear malice in it. Squidward is in full frame and he looks visibly afraid. The shot goes to the crowd with SpongeBob in centre frame and he too is booing. Now that's very much unlike SpongeBob. Now that's not the oddest thing though. What's odd is that everyone had hyper-realistic eyes, very, very detailed, clearly not shots of real people's eyes, but something a bit more real than CGI. The pupils were red. Some of us looked at each other obviously confused, but since we weren't the writers, we didn't question its appeal to children. Yet. The shot then goes to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed, looking very forlorn. The view out of his porthole window is of a night sky, so it isn't very long after the concert. The unsettling part is at that point, there's no sound. Literally, no sound. Not even the feedback from the speakers in the room. It's as if the speakers were turned off, though their status showed them working perfectly. He just sat there, blinking, in the silence for about 30 seconds. Then he started to sob, softly. He put his tentacles over his eyes, and he cried quietly for a full minute more. All the while, a sound in the background very slowly growing from nothing to barely audible. It sounded like a slight breeze through a forest. The screen slowly begins to zoom in on his face, and by slow, I mean it's only noticeable if you look at shots 10 seconds apart, side by side. His sobbing gets louder, more full of hurt and anger. The screen then twitches a bit, as if it had twisted in on itself, and for a split second, and then back to normal. The wind through the trees sound gets slowly louder and more severe, as if a storm is brewing somewhere. The eerie part is the sound, and Squidward's sobbing. It sounded real, as if the sound wasn't coming from the speakers, but as if the speakers were holes the sound was coming through from the other side. As good a sound as the studio likes to have, they don't purchase the equipment to be that good to produce sound of that quality. Below the sound of the wind and sobbing, very faint, something sounded like laughing. It came at odd intervals and never lasted more than a second, so you had a hard time pinning it. We watched this show twice, so pardon me if things sound too specific, but I've had time to think about them. After 30 seconds of this, the screen blurred and twitched violently, and something flashed over the screen, as if a single frame had been replaced. The lead animation editor paused and rewound frame by frame. What we saw was horrible. It was a still photo of a dead child. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The face was mangled and bloodied, one eye dangling over his upturned face, popped. He was naked down to his underwear. His stomach was crudely cut open and his entrails were laying beside him. He was laying on possibly a road. The most upsetting part was that it was a shadow of the photographer. There was no crime tape, no evidence tags or markers, and the angle was completely off for a shot designed to be evidence. It would seem the photographer was the person responsible for the child's death. We were, of course, mortified, but we had to press on. We just had to hope that it was some sort of sick joke. The screen flipped back to Squidward, who was still sobbing, louder than before, and half body in frame. There was now what appeared to be blood running down his face from his eyes. The blood was also done in hyper-realistic style, looking as if you had touched it, you would have blood on your fingers. The wind sounded now as if it was in a gale blowing through the forest. There were even snapping sounds of branches. The laughing, a deep baritone lasting at longer intervals and coming more frequently. After about 20 seconds, the screen again twisted and showed a single frame photo. The editor was reluctant to go back. We all were, but he knew he had to. This time, the photo was that of what appeared to be a little girl, no older than the first child. She was laying on her stomach, her barrettes in a pool of blood next to her. Her left eye was also popped. She was naked apart from her underwear, and her entrails were piled on top of her above another crude cut along her back. Again, the body was on the street, and a photographer's shadow was visible, very similar in size and shape to the first. I had to choke back vomit, and one intern, the only female in the room, ran out. The show resumed. About 5 seconds after the second photo played, Squidward went silent, as did all sound, like it was when the scene started. He put his tentacles down and his eyes were now done in hyper-realism like the others were in the beginning of the episode. They were bleeding, bloodshot and pulsating. He just stared at the screen as if watching the viewer. After about 10 seconds he started sobbing, this time not covering his eyes. The sound was piercing and loud, and the most fear-inducing of all, his sobbing was mixed with screams. Tears and blood were dripping down his face at a heavy rate. The wind sound came back, and so did the deep-voiced laughing, and this time the still photo lasted for a good 5 frames. The animator stopped it on the 4th and backed up. This time the photo was of a boy about the same age, but this time the scene was different. The entrails were just being pulled out from a stomach wound by a large hand, the right eye popped and dangling, blood trickling down it. The animator proceeded. It was hard to believe, but the next one was different. We couldn't tell what had happened though. He went on to the next, same thing. He then went back to the first and played them quicker. That's when I lost it. I vomited on the floor. The animating and sound editors gasped at the screen. The 5 frames were not as if they were 5 different photos. They were played out as if they were frames from a video. We saw a hand slowly lift out the guts. We saw the kid's eyes focus on it, and we even saw 2 frames of the kid beginning to blink. The lead sound editor told us to stop. He had to call in the creators to see this. Mr. Hillenberg arrived within about 15 minutes. He was confused as to why he was called down there, so the editor just continued the episode. Once a few frames were shown, all screaming, all sound again stopped. Squidward stared at the viewer, full frame of the face for about 3 seconds. Then the shot quickly panned out, and a deep voice said, "Do it." And we see in Squidward's hands a shotgun. He immediately puts the gun in his mouth and pulls the trigger. Realistic blood and brain matter splattered the wall behind him and his bed, and he flies back with the force. The last 5 seconds of this episode show the body on the bed, on its side, one eye dangling on what's left of his head above the floor, staring blankly at it. Then the episode ends. Mr. Hillenberg is obviously angry at this. He demands to know what the hell was going on. Most people left the room at this point, so it was just a handful of us to watch it again. Viewing the episode twice only served to imprint the entirety of it in my mind, and it's caused me horrible, horrible nightmares ever since. I am so sorry I stayed. The only theory we could think of was the file was edited by someone in the chain from the drawing studio to here. The CTO was called in to analyse what happened. The analysis of the file did show that it was edited over by new material. However, the timestamp of it was a mere 24 seconds before we began viewing it. All equipment involved was examined for foreign software and hardware as well as glitches, as if the timestamp may have been glitched and showed the wrong time. But everything checked out fine. We don't know what happened, and to this day, nobody does. There was an investigation, of course, due to the nature of the photos, but nothing came of it. None of the children seen were identified, and there were no clues gathered from the data involved, nor physical clues in the photos. I've never believed in unexplainable phenomena, but now that I've had something happen and I can't prove anything about it beyond anecdotal evidence, I have to think twice about what I've seen and what I know now.